Welcome back to the Speaking and Communicating podcast. I am your host, Roberta. If you are looking to improve your communication skills, both professionally and personally, this is the podcast you should be tuning into. By the end of this episode, please remember to subscribe, give a rating, and a review. We live in a global world and it's becoming more and more inclusive and diverse. And my guest today, Erica J. Glover, she is an educator, has a PhD in urban education, and is a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist. Today, she's going to share with us how these principles apply in the education space and how, no matter where you are and you find yourself as an educator, you'll be able to apply these based on the research that she did when she was pursuing her PhD studies. And before I go any further, please help me to welcome Erica to the show. Hi, Erica.
Morning, Roberta. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. It's a good morning indeed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
In which part of the US are you based?
I'm actually in Cleveland, Ohio,
Oh,
where
okay.
fall is very real. For us, there's sometimes no difference between fall and winter, but we definitely are in the fall space here.
I'm right next door to you, Chicago, Illinois. Yes, the leaves have all kinds of different colors at this time.
Yes, the Windy City.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, raised in a two-parent household. Both of my parents were married when I was born. Went to church 8 days a week, and was actually right. And was actually a part of a lot of youth organizations. So I share that because that's actually where I began to understand my potential in leadership. I taught Sunday school at 12 years old. And so obviously, my parents noticed something in myself. I went on to college. I played basketball in college, went on to college, graduated as an intervention specialist with a degree in special education, worked with students who are categorized as having an emotional disturbances. And I say categorized strongly because for me, after understanding and learning about my students, looking at their files, when I had to, I realized that it was really relationships that weren't built. And so they were seen as, this is my humble opinion, as the bad kids, ended up in a bad class where we did a lot of work around empowerment to help them understand who they are and who they're supposed to be, and so that they don't have to dwell in the space of what people have played, the identities that folks have placed on them. So I moved from that space of the classroom into administration. I was an administrator for about 7 years. I went into HR, did HR. So I was the recruitment manager for a school district for about 2 years. And then as a result of my goals of recruiting more Black and Brown people, I started to understand policy and systems differently. So then I pivoted into the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where I sit proudly and firmly now, right? I started an organization called Disruptive University based off of my research of Black teachers. I was really trying to understand what was it that, Black teachers experiences as adolescents when they were in school and as professionals that helps to speak to how they support young people who are situated in urban settings. And so Disruptive University is really a holistic approach of supporting scholars, educators, and leaders all at the same time in the best case scenario, so that the learning, the co-constructing of knowledge and understanding experiences are all happening together.
Right. Speaking of tying in the emotional intelligence of the teachers now versus when they were in school, and whether they were put in those behavioral problematic groups, so to speak, what did you find was the connection there?
So one thing I think is important to understand is how we are socialized. Oftentimes people ask questions around the educator, and I will always go back to this. The entry point of when you learn how to be an educator is when you're a scholar, right? So when I was becoming an educator as a scholar, we didn't really talk about social emotional learning a lot, right? So now this generation, during this time period, SEL is very, very stressed, although very value laden, is stressed, right? And so now we're at a point where it's the gap is, okay, well, we can't leave the adults behind in this conversation, right? How do we ensure that adults the leaders, the staff are also understanding emotional intelligence and how that affects who they show up at when they're at work, right? Understanding how to appropriately respond to differences, a lot of times as a former educator and administrator, is the root of the problem, right? If there's a between what a scholar believes should happen and an educator believes should happen versus what an educator believes should happen or how they responded. Same thing with the administrator, right? It's all about how we behave, how we respond, and how we begin to understand. That is the foundational level of emotional intelligence, right? Understanding self, understand others, relationship skills, management and regulation skills, and how does that all present itself in real time. We kind of skipped that in the space of education. I don't recall going to,
I don't remember
right,
emotional
right. In my
intelligence
teacher prep,
class.
in my teacher prep classes, we might have talked about a lot of psychology or theory, but never in terms of what that looks like for me and my experience in my space. And now we are moving a little bit to that space because we're talking a lot about self-care now for educators, but we haven't really taken the time to dive deep into, all right, if I am working across differences, I need to understand who I am and how I came to believe what I believe so I can begin to think that way about others. That's when you actually begin to leverage commonalities and differences. That's why emotional intelligence is so important. So important that I'm spending time writing a book about emotional intelligence and culture responsive classrooms, because at the center of that is student voice. My voice should matter, not to the extent that I'm being heard, but you're actualizing based upon what you hear me saying. This is how you begin to empower scholars differently. So now they're engaged in your classroom. Now they're holding themselves accountable because you're acting on what they're saying.
This is interesting because in this podcast, we talk about leadership, we talk about EQ, emotional quotient, and how leaders should have this emotional intelligence because they lead people. But it looks like we start addressing that problem once people are in the working space and they are full-on grown-ups with graduate degrees. Seriously, why don't we start this at school?
And so that's an interesting question. There is, I guess, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of the founders or early researchers of raw cultural responsive teaching and learning. And when you look into the different research around this theory, this concept, you'll hear a lot of folks talking about bringing in or embedding social emotional learning. Some may describe it as social emotional learning. There's another research who talks about be careful about the values that you are pushing on people when you're talking about social emotional learning as well, right? When you think about the cultural mismatch between educators and between scholars, you have to be careful around that. But ultimately, when you're talking about sustaining cultural responsive teaching and learning, you have to look at critical consciousness. You have to understand the socio-political context that students are coming from. Scholars are bringing it to your classroom in order to truly understand them, right? And so by default, classroom teachers, administrators, they kind of get to inherit relationships, right? You'll hear people talk about teacher-student relationships, administrator-student relationships all the time. That's by default. That's because I have to come to your school. That's
of
because I have
course.
to get into your classroom, right? But when you get to authentic relationships, it's, oh, I know more about the experiences that you have at home in your culture and community. I know how systemic racism and systemic inequities influences your outcomes at home that you are bringing into the school space. For example, I understand during COVID, what the demographics of those who had COVID or
Who had access to computers. I remember in Chicago, there was a program
exactly
about
access to
households that didn't have
technology.
computers. Yeah.
Access to technology, the fear of getting the shot because of what we know as Black Americans, what has happened to Black Americans in medicine out history, right? And so understanding those things, understanding that there is no poverty of a culture of poverty. I don't want to be in poverty, right? But understanding what happens as a result of me being in poverty, right? All of these things that young people experience will influence how they show up. And if you aren't intentional with understanding the different ways that young people show up, then you're not being the cultural responsive educator that they may need. And I say may because some young people will hold back and just do it out of compliance what is asked, but some young people want who they are to be honored. And as a human being, they deserve that.
That's what we all look for. But then to look at it from the teacher's side, do they get that level of training as part of their teacher training?
That's a great question. So remember, I tend to go back to the scholar, right? So the question really is, when they were a scholar, were they really taught to be, or did they understand how to be culturally aware, what that means? How do you become more culturally aware? Most likely, no. I'll say that because that's not how I learned, right?
Right.
Get into this mold and learn, right? And so this is why the imposter syndrome can come to pass for people later as adults, because I'm always comparing myself to other people instead of trying to be the person that I am, right? So when you think about how that looks for the educator, they have had to have been socialized that way too, right? And so if they didn't get it when they were going through elementary, middle, high school, then the hope is that they get it in teacher prep. But from my experiences, that didn't happen. And so I know in the district where I was, working as an HR director, we were reaching out to our local university partners saying, hey, we need culturally responsive educators. Like, what's going on in your curriculum? Like, how you socializing, what experiences, what things are you doing so that before they even step foot in the classroom, they've been able to have more than a surface level understanding of cultural differences. There was one point in time, my colleague and I through Disruptive University, would work with pre-service teachers intentionally over the summer. We would invite them to the community center. We would do PBLs, like project-based learning units, where, like our most recent one, we had Black boys working with us. And we say with because they are experts of their experiences,
of course,
to understand how the media can influence perceptions and perspectives. And so we invited all of the pre-service teachers that we invited were all white males or females into spaces in the community with Black and brown educators and scholars. And the feedback that we received back from them was just incredible, right? Like one of the female participants said, you know what, I don't even understand why I felt nervous driving into the parking lot. And she said it, I don't even know why I felt nervous. And these are the experiences that we want folks to have before they get into the classroom. Because remember, emotional intelligence is how do I respond to that feeling, right?
Because of better understanding from the other person's side.
There it is, Roberta. There it is.
Because here's the thing, when you talk about cultural awareness, since you were a scholar, a white student growing up in a white neighborhood and then becoming a teacher one day and then assigned to an inner city school. And like you said, the universities and the colleges don't offer that training. Where would they have had that?
And so I want to also acknowledge that there are some universities that do intentionally like focus on urban
areas
during that research. But where, that's a tough question to ask. Like, right, it depends upon what they're experiencing with their family, right? You'll have individuals who are able to experience summer vacations in different countries, in different settings.
Create open-mindedness, yes.
Right. So you have opportunities, but the question I think really that is at the center of where I think we're trying to understand is, what are we intentionally trying to do? What are we doing on purpose? And this is why, regardless of where you're at, across, and I'll speak for America because I'm American, right? Regardless of where you're at, there should be some intentionality around becoming more culturally aware. And let me tell you why. Technology has influenced not just education, but society in this world in such a way that everything is global, right? And so if we are trying to prepare global citizens, why would we not want to prepare everyone to become more culturally aware? Right. And when you think about the opportunities for our young people to work at the international level, cultural awareness is everything. Especially when you want to have.
It actually benefits them, yes, because they can adapt no matter which space they find themselves in.
Absolutely.
Which then, that's usually when we talk about leadership and the workspace on this podcast, we talk about not only emotional intelligence, but the fact that I've had so many guests say it makes business sense to be culturally aware, to apply the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your company, because you're going to have so many different perspectives, because you're not just going to get them from one group. You're going
Yeah,
to understand the market on a broader level and therefore create products that hopefully will be more valued, will add more value to people based on the fact that you had so many different ideas and so many different perspectives. It actually makes good business sense, they say.
absolutely. And so I acknowledge that, right? Diversity matters. I also pushed back on ensuring that it is not very interest convergence heavy. Like, and I say that, like, businesses need people when people need businesses, right? So there is some type of reciprocal relationship that's happening. But when you're thinking and coming from the space of HR about retainment, like, how do I retain? I can get people in the door. I can get diverse bodies there, right? But how do I get you to stay? That's a sense of belonging, which is very different. So a lot of people will lead with the business, the bottom business line. I push back, or I push businesses and organizations to push beyond that to the space of, how do I show that I value and honor your difference? So much that you feel as if you belong and you don't want to leave this organization. That's another level of that's the inclusion, the sense of belonging area of the DEI, right? And then the equity comes in. Well, what is the data telling us about the experiences that we're seeing? If I'm seeing that there are more of this group of people who are leaving, why? And what am I trying to do to understand that? What are their experiences that they're having?
Erica, are you still there?
So, what are the experiences of people who are leaving? I think that's going to push us beyond the bottom business line of just looking for diversity in numbers. We have to understand what the experience is in order to value people differently. And so the bottom business line a lot of times works very well for many organizations. But when you're thinking about equities and you're thinking about your data and you think about what your data is telling you in terms of the gaps and the reasons why you don't have representation in so many spaces, you have to be able to understand the experience and push beyond the bottom business line.
That is so interesting because so I grew up during apartheid. It changed when I was 18. And so you had these corporates who never had diverse employees before. So what they did was they thought pumping, I don't know if the government also had something to do with this, in the sense that they gave them incentives for just pump money into the problem. Just get these graduates who are Black, colored, different terminology in South Africa, by the way, I don't mean it in the American context, and Indian into these formerly white-only companies and just pump money and equity into them. And unfortunately, money does not solve that problem. People still left, even though they were getting paid salaries and bonuses they've never seen before. If you are not treated right, like you say, if you cannot get them to stay, they're never going to stay.
Right. And I think that's where, intentionally or unintentionally, I believe many organizations drop the ball. You can't have these vision and mission statements around, diversity, equity, and inclusion and only hit diversity. Folks who are often marginalized understands what it means to be marginalized. And so in order for a person who has never, or may say, oh, that hasn't happened to me, or they might say, well, I know it's happened to some. When you start speaking that language, it's definitely time for you to learn more about other experiences, right? And a lot of times organizations have a hard time looking themselves in the mirror that way, because when you know something isn't right, guess what you have to do?
You have to fix it. You have to
You're
start
right. You're
peeling the
responsible.
layers and doing something about it.
And so, systems are designed to do exactly what they're doing, right? And so when you are that committed to your vision or your mission statement, what people experience within your organization will matter. How they communicate that to you will matter. If they are worried about completing a survey, when you don't have good survey results, that's telling you something, right?
Pay
There's something,
attention.
behavior is a method of communication, and just as much as verbal words are. And so I think it's important for organizations. I know we're talking about organizations, but even in the educational space, right? Like, why are Black and brown teachers not there? Why are they leaving, right? And or what are the experience of folks who have disabilities? Like, are we doing everything that we can to support them that way, right? So like we spend a lot of time unpacking what diversity means for folks to understand that we all are diverse, period.
Right.
So in certain areas, depending on the room you're in, the time, the context, you will experience oppression, right? You might feel oppressed, you might feel disadvantaged. You might also experience privilege. It's how do I, going back to emotional intelligence, how do I make myself more aware of the experiences I don't understand? And how do I appropriately respond in ways that shows that I'm thinking about the perspective of others, and I'm operating not just out of empathy and compassion, but there's action behind what I'm doing.
Let me try and play devil's advocate for a second. Remember the movie Dangerous Minds? I think it starred Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yes.
She was teaching at an inner city school. Coolio made the soundtrack. I remember growing up, first of all, I wanted to be a teacher. And the first thing I was told was, you're too smart. You must never. They are the least paid professional. You're going to do it for the rest of your life. Don't even think about it. That's why I never started teaching. So one, it's the least paid job. It sounds like a thankless job. And the work, in addition to just teaching your math, your sociology, whatever it is, it sounds like it's just a lot. It just keeps being a lot, and the pay does not match, which means there's no motivator with the pay as well. When I think of that Michelle Pfeiffer movie, which by the way was based on a true story, the extent to which she had to go to these kids' homes and find out their problems. If you are a white teacher in an inner city school, like, is that really what it takes?
So one of the things that I will say, and I want to be careful to not generalize across inner city schools, but what I will say is that there are some things about education that has evolved. One of those things is that educational systems are starting to realize the importance of different roles outside of the space of an educator is needed, right?
Okay.
So, for example, the I Promise School is more of a wraparound approach of teaching and learning, where you have folks who may not necessarily be educators supporting scholars in that space. There are some schools who have social workers in that space. You have some schools who have success coaches in those spaces. You have some schools who have family resource coordinators, who, to your point, might be the cultural bridge between the community and the school.
And the yes.
Right, because of who they know. And so education is definitely pivoting in some ways in terms of who we are bringing to the table to support our scholars outside of just the educator. It really takes a village.
Because it sounds like a lot. If as an educator, that's going to be your entire assignment.
Yes. You have folks in many spaces, and I will probably say more urban than not because of funding. Where folks are being creative with bringing in different types of supports and services and programs. COVID has, in terms of the dollars that folks have access to, folks are able to be a little more creative with how they're using those dollars to support, student mastery and learning, to push back against any of those statistics that they speak about in terms of learning loss, if you will. But there's also one thing I want to point out that you actually mentioned, Roberta, is this notion of pay and thankless jobs, right? And so what hasn't happened in the space of education is it hasn't caught up with the demand that is placed upon educators. True. And so historically speaking, is not to dismiss with the work of educators, but now we're in a place where we should be honoring the different hats that educators need to wear in the classroom, and that should equate to pay. That should equate to different way of even looking at what school is. Right now we've been socialized to believe that school has to happen from this time to this time, but every other organization and business has adapted to flex time. When will
That
education,
is true.
right? When will education do that? When will we see that? I know we at one point in time talking about merit pay, but when will we notice that being able to personalize education that folks want it to be means that I have to be a more complex educator, which means I have to spend just as much time studying and understanding self and content in your culture than just throwing it out there based upon a pacing guide or this curriculum that doesn't understand the experiences of my scholars. And so things of that nature, like those are things that are very telling, that helps me understand that education is definitely still behind.
It is, because just like when we talk about organizations, we say, just remember you work with humans and the machines come second. They operate the machines. The humans are the priority. So it's the same with the teachers. If there's gotta be a way to motivate them and to just so they can remember that the kids are the humans that they are rearing and bringing up, and then the math and everything, the science, the biology is what they're learning.
Yeah, and
in addition to all the other emotional intelligence, because it sounds to me, and we talk about it even here, we say, oh, why don't schools teach yoga, why don't schools teach meditation, and now we're adding emotional intelligence, and we're going to add something else tomorrow in addition to their specialty subjects. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of folks who will say, at some point in time, there's certain things in the space of education that is not needed to have, that students don't need to learn, right? There are some people who push back and say, why do scholars have to do 4 years of math? Like, just because we've always done it, or is it something that scholars will need later on in life? And so questions like that are very difficult to answer because of this thing of we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
Until we're able to pivot and think more innovatively, which was not happening with scholars. We still aren't being innovative with how we teach. And so guess what we bring out? We bring out the same type of machine, if you will, with our scholars, because we are killing creativity. And so, to your point, all of that is important. I think ultimately the bottom line is you have to be the person who is willing to do what is best for kids, no matter what. And when you get to the space that you can't do that over anything else, then that might be the time that you need to leave.
Yes, because like I said, when we talk about leadership coaching and all the aspects that go into that to make you a better leader, it sounds to me that's the stuff you are talking about with the scholars. So we basically just studied in adulthood.
We basically did. We're a little behind. And
we live in an economy, sorry to interrupt you, Erica. We live in an economy where 2 incomes in every household are now becoming more imperative. It's no longer an option. So the mom and the dad are not home, they're at work, so they can pay bills and feed you. Who's going to have time to teach you emotional intelligence at home?
Yeah, and so I think that's a loaded question. I think that and what I don't want to do is make assumptions about all of our scholars, what they go home to, right? But I also want to ensure that I make the point that most scholars spend most of their time at school.
Okay.
Most of them spend in America, most scholars spend most of their time at school. When it comes to home, yes, there are definitely some things that we want to see our parents and or our caregivers doing outside of the school, right? It works both ways. There are expectations of the family, there are expectations of the educator, but there's also some scholars whose family dynamics look very different, right? They might be raised by a grandparent. They might be in a foster home. There's so many experiences that we have to think about and understand that many of our scholars are bringing assets and strengths to the table. We
Yes.
also want to use those assets and those strengths to help build upon and nurture in those spaces where they need other additional support. And so one of the things that my rule of thumb was, I'm always going to involve parents, right? Family and caregivers. I'm over communicating, quite honestly. But at the same time, I'm never taking for granted what is happening, or I'm never living and operating off of what's not happening at home. Once you get to my classroom, you're my son, you're my daughter, you're my niece, you're my nephew, you're my cousin, you're my best friend's friend, daughter, simply, whatever. You belong to someone else, but you're now a relationship, authentic relationship with me. And so I am going to do my best to do what is best for you.
This has been not only so eye-opening, but I think that when it comes to cultural awareness as well, it works from all angles. All of us need to be culturally aware. And especially in the education space, there's, with all the diverse teachers and diverse students, there's just so much with this topic that we can continue to cover. But before I take any more of your time, Erica, what are your last words of wisdom?
Remain a lifelong learner, and committed to what that means. And oftentimes folks will espouse, oh yeah, I'm a lifelong learner, but get a little nervous when you hit that space of discomfort or cognitive dissonance because it doesn't feel good or because I'm uncomfortable. Lifelong learning says that I'm diving deep and I'm giving myself grace to, make a mistake, grace to not understand, but also grace to always improve. And so I think that if we're all committed to that, and not the theory into action of lifelong learning, then that cultural awareness ultimately will happen.
Words of wisdom from Dr. Erica J. Glover, the educator and a DE&I specialist. Erica, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time, Roberta. I appreciate it.
Truly a pleasure. And most of all, I just want us to take a moment to thank the teachers for the amazing work that they do, the impact that they have on the young ones. It doesn't go unnoticed. And I don't know how many stories you've heard. So many grown-ups will go on TV and say, I still remember my 4th grade teacher encouraged me to do that. Their impact is lifelong.
Yes, it is.
Agreed. It is. So thank you so much, teachers, for the wonderful work that you do. Erica, do you have any social media handles we can reach you on after today?
Yes. Both on Instagram and Twitter as Dr. Erica Glover. Facebook, Erica Glover. And please visit me at www.disruptoruniversity.com. www.disruptor, and that's with an ER, DISRUPTER, university.com. Check out some of the work that we're doing. And Erica is ERICA GLOVER. And finally, last shameless plug, if you don't mind, Roberta.
Please,
I'll be dropping our book late January, February, called Centering Student Voice, a guide for cultivating emotional intelligence in educators and culturally responsive classrooms. So
we'll be looking out for it. Yes.
So please make sure you hit me up on any of those social media handles.
I will write it, all of that on the show notes, both your social media handles and the upcoming book and the date for which you should look out for it. Thank you very much, Erica. It's been a pleasure having you with us today.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe, give a rating and a review. That was Dr. Erica J. Glover.